Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 210 of Humanity Rising. It's a day of contradictions here in the United States. As many of you probably saw on the news last night, there was yet another mass shooting following on the mass shooting last week in Atlanta, Georgia. This one was in Boulder, Colorado. A man walked into a supermarket, opened fire, and within a minute or two, there were 10 people who lay dead, others wounded. The dead included a police officer. The man was slightly wounded and was taken out and is now in a hospital and being charged for multiple crimes. At the same time, Evanston, Illinois, today announced for the first time in U.S. history that a governmental entity, in this case a city, is going to begin reparations for African Americans living in Evanston, Illinois, $10 million to those who can show lineage back to slaves and history of discrimination. And very interestingly, the money that will be paid out over the next 10 years is coming from cannabis tax. So once again, on a day-by-day basis, we see the darkness and we also see the light. And Humanity Rising seeks to honor all the diversity in the world and hold it all in an equilibrium of an open heart. In that spirit, I would like to invite all of you to join me in just a minute or two of heart coherence. Every day we like to center ourselves in our hearts. So just gather yourself in your body. Take a few deep breaths. Close your eyes if you can. And place your attention on your heart. Listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of deep gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive with beating hearts at this extraordinary moment in human history. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude for each and every one of you who have joined our session today, I want to open our program with a comment on race. If there's one issue that has come up during the pandemic. It's the issue of ethnicity and race. The pandemic has challenged all of us everywhere to look directly into issues that have been long suppressed everywhere. It was focalized by the death on May 25th last year of George Floyd, as you all remember, suffocated as a white police officer put his knee on George Floyd's neck and asphyxiated him. And in some way, that ignited a tremor of conscience, not only around the United States, but around the world. In the largest protests with the most numbers of any event in recorded history. Somehow, as we were going through the scourge of the pandemic, it was the image of a Black man being asphyxiated by a white man that quickened the conscience of the world, worldwide. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Racism in the United States is so deep. I'm a 10th generation American. My people first came to these shores in 1686, and my ancestors have lived racism in America. First against the native populations, and then importing massive numbers of Africans to work on the plantations. But the issue of race is worldwide. Just yesterday, the United States and the European Union condemned China for genocide against the Uyghur people. The Chinese have constructed the largest concentration camps in the world in history. Over 1 million Uyghurs, a Muslim minority, are incarcerated and are being tortured, killed, indoctrinated, their children taken from them and put in re-education schools. This is after what the Chinese did in Tibet in the 1950s, 60s, until the present day, the obliteration of Tibetan culture and the destruction of thousands of temples and monasteries. Last year in Burma, a Buddhist country, went after the Rohingya minority in what the United Nations said was the most acute persecutions in the world, and drove an entire people out of Burma, killing most of the men, many of the women. And now there's desolation. And even Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel laureate, the hero of democracy, 20 years ago, was a spokesperson for the Burmese government, the Myanmar government, legitimating and defending an essential act of genocide. You look at India, as the Hindu majority continues to persecute the Muslim minority with the active support of the Modi government. Modi government has also gone after the indigenous people, the few indigenous people in South India, and are seeking to wipe them out, building huge concentration camps. India calls itself the largest democracy on earth. We remember Rwanda in the 1990s in Africa, as the Hutu majority over a period of months butchered to death. Over 1 million Tutsis, butchered them to death at close range. And Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, didn't act till it was too late. And he was later to say that it was the greatest mistake in his life. We remember Germany and what they did to the Jews in the Second World War. Easily the greatest crime in human history. The scientific, systematic, intentional government policy that led to the deaths of 6 million Jews in the ovens. I've been to Auschwitz. I've seen the scientific precision of genocide. Even in Canada, beautiful, lovely nation of Canada, systematic oppression against the First Nations people. The United States, we've mentioned. All around the world, there is something in the human psyche, some toxicity that not only compels us in some deeply dysfunctional way to view differences of skin color or belief or ethnic origin as different, but motivates us to want to wipe it out. So the issue of race, the issue of ethnicity, is a deep issue that afflicts us all, everywhere, without exception. And this may be the reason why the pandemic, which drew all of us without exception into the same experience of undergoing a viral pandemic, has ignited the one issue that also unites us as one, and that is our deep racial consciousness and fear of the other. And perhaps nowhere is that more present than in the Middle East. We all have borne witness not only of the way the Jews were forced to suffer the hands of the Nazis and the Germans and the Europeans generally, bearing in mind that when some Jews were able to escape on ships, came all the way to the Caribbean, President Roosevelt turned them back, knowing they were going back to their deaths. And that was the proximate causation of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And the deepest tragedy that emerged out of that, as one people were liberated, is that they turned right around and began to oppress the indigenous peoples, the Palestinians, and systematically, over time, drove them out and drove them from their land and put them under conditions of horrendous oppression. I spent time in Israel. I went to the University of Tel Aviv in 1972 and 1973, so I saw it up close and deeply personally. So as we look at the issue of the Palestinians today, which is the subject of our session, let us look at them as a mirror for what all of us in some way are participating in. And let us use that mirror to examine our own souls, our own conscience. And in the spirit of Chekhov, when he said those immortal words, it's only drop by drop, he said, that we squeeze the slave out of ourselves. Let us contemplate what more can we do where we are to liberate humanity from the scourge of racism and ethnic oppression. So in this spirit, I want to welcome Alison Ramer, who has been working on the Palestinian issue for many years. And what was intriguing to me when I spoke with Alison is the way that she is working on Palestinian human rights online. I hadn't noted that concept before. I know that this is a volatile issue for many of us, for many of you. And again, let us enter into this dialogue and this presentation today in the spirit of deep humility, knowing that none of us have clean hands. And therefore, we have to open our hearts to each other in much more profound ways than we have. So Alison, welcome to Humanity Rising, and I look forward to your presentation, and then we'll have a dialogue for the balance of the time. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Jim, Garrison, and the Humanity Rising community. Thank you very much for having me here today. I'm Alison Carmel Ramer, and I'm currently the International Relations Manager for Hamlet, which is the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media. I'm originally from just to be clear, also about who I am. So I grew up in the United States, and for the past 10 years, I've been working on human rights related issues in the Middle East and North Africa, primarily in Israel and Palestine. And my work is focused on human rights in the online space. So I will just share my screen now. Okay. And need to make a presentation. Here we go. Okay. Oops. Great. So we will start here. So Jim gave a really great introduction. I think that, yeah, definitely when we're thinking about humanity today, and when I think about the past 10 years, I really think about the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa in particular, and how many 10 years ago, I could have thought about traveling to many places, perhaps in the Middle East, but several of them are gone or not accessible any longer to us. When we think about Syria, when we think about Yemen, when we think about Egypt, Libya, many people in the region are really suffering as a result of a lot of unfortunately powerful states with interests in, as we all know the long story, interests in natural resources, interests in economic and military gains. And we will talk more about that through the presentation. I think more broadly, what's important to understand about Palestine also, as Jim said, is that we're talking about people who have been occupied first first having their claims to their homeland and having their homeland essentially taken from them in 1948, when the State of Israel was also established and declared. And then another part of their homeland being occupied then in 1967. So currently, when I speak in the talk, I'm going to talk about Palestine, and I'm talking about historic Palestine, which is from the river to the sea. So this includes the West Bank and Gaza and current day Israel. So that's historic Palestine. And when I talk about Palestinians in Palestine, that's what I'm talking about. And then when we talk about occupation, we're speaking more specifically about West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So that's just some technicality about the context to help as we're having this discussion today. So let's get started. So first, I want to also introduce some background about what digital rights are, because a lot of people may not be aware of their digital rights. So we have human rights. We all have human rights, which are, and digital rights are an extension of those human rights. So if your human right is the right to freedom of expression, you have the right to freedom of expression in the public space outside, and you have the right to freedom of expression in the online. You also have the right to privacy, the right to access information, the right to organization and assembly. There are several rights which have been highlighted by digital rights activists over the past 10 years, and which the UN Human Rights Council has affirmed are also human rights, by saying that the same rights that people have offline must also be protected online. But for the purpose of our work, we're focusing online and how the rights are experienced in the online space. So in the case of Palestine, here are some of the duty bearers and power holders as we talk about them when we talk about advocacy. And here we have Israel and Jerusalem, Israel's domestic laws, which are just of Israel itself, or just should be of Israel itself, or what we think of today as Israel, and international human rights laws and treaties that Israel has signed. Then you have the Palestinian Authority, which is in the West Bank minus Jerusalem, and they have a Palestinian domestic law and also international conventions that they have signed. And Hamas, which is the de facto government in Gaza, and uses applicable laws and regulations on their level, which are Egyptian and British mandates. There's a complicated situation because there's also a fragmentation between Palestinians themselves as a result of the conflict. And you have the West typically empowering Fatah and the Fatah movement, and other more radical and more Islamic states and powers supporting Hamas historically. And so you have also this split within the Palestinian Legislative Council, in which are the Palestinians themselves. But we have this year a change in that, and we have an election coming up. So this is very special. There hasn't been an election in, I think, more than 10 years now. So you may see that Palestinians will find themselves under more like two authorities, Israel. And Israel, you can be a Palestinian, of course, and be a citizen of Israel and have domestic laws that are responsible for governing your rights, Israel's domestic laws, or you could be a Palestinian in West Bank and under Israeli occupation, and there's another set of laws which are related to the laws of occupation and the laws of war in international law, in which Israel is the occupying power. And so there's a separate set of Israeli policies and practices and international law policies and practices as well. That's important. And then we also have our internet giants and our tech giants, which are like many corporations, quite powerful and holding a lot of power for how we can access our rights. And we, I've just listed a few here that we've researched: Facebook, Google, Twitter, YouTube, PayPal, and we've done in-depth looks on how they're policies and practices impact Palestinian lives. And then we have surveillance companies, and we'll talk a little more about surveillance technologies in Israel, but Israel is the #1 developer and exporter of surveillance technologies in the world, many of which they're sold globally, and many of which are sold to human rights violating countries and used, unfortunately, to oppress activists. So this is also a part of the story. So here's a little bit about Israel and the role that Israel plays in Palestinian digital rights. They have absolute control of the Palestinian ICT infrastructure. So two-state solution, not on the way, not even in a digital way. And this is a digital occupation. So anytime we're using the internet, including right now in Palestine, where I am, this is going through Israel, and they have complete access and total surveillance of my internet usage. And then you have the militarization of Palestinian virtual space. There's a lot of attempts of, as we will see, to use the internet for military advantage, to get information, to collude or coerce people using social media profiles, using private information of people, we will talk more about later. And then, of course, there's legislations that are designed by the state to shrink the space for civic engagement, particularly of Palestinians, and which discriminate against Palestinians. And as I mentioned earlier, yes, Israel has the highest number per capita of mass surveillance technologies in the world. Here's just a little bit more about the ICT infrastructure. Something that you probably didn't know or might not know about Palestine is that Palestinians did not have access to 3G until I think 2 or 3 years ago. For many years, there was no access to 3G, which really limited the economic development. Palestinians still don't have access in many places to 3G, which is basic for being able to use an application like Uber or, any applications. Really, you need to have this 3G access so you can access the internet beyond a Wi-Fi. And still many places in Palestine don't have this. And while Israel has 5G technologies. The other thing that makes this complex is that Israel has 500,000 settlers in the West Bank, and they have created the infrastructure for their telecommunications companies to be operating in those settlements and to provide services beyond the settlements themselves. And this is a way also of providing a cheaper service than the Palestinian telecommunications companies. And they're doing it illegally because they're on Palestinian land providing those services both to Israelis and then also to Palestinians as well. To get an economic advantage. There has been, today actually is Israel's election day. And so, there is changes in the bills, but these are just some sample bills that I wanted to share with you. There's something called the National Cyber Directorate, and basically Israel has been working to centralize all of the data across many different sectors for a citizen or for someone that they're a Palestinian under occupation. So they want to collect information like health information, tax information, education information, private social media data, information from dating apps, all different types of information, and to centralize this information in something called the National Cyber Directorate. And this would be under the Prime Minister's power directly. The employees are protected from any legal proceedings. And this also gives the ability of the Prime Minister not to have to go to the courts to get access to a lot of information on citizens under the pretext of fighting cybercrime. So obviously, for people who are concerned about their privacy, this is a very, impossible kind of situation really to live in, and their safety, because also Israel, of course, collects biometric data, including facial recognition data, eyes, fingerprints, things like that. And we know that when data gets centralized, that it's much easier for it to be used by malicious actors. So you always want to decentralize data, but centralizing it is a way to gain more power and control, as the Prime Minister is trying to do. Next, prohibiting photographing of soldiers of the Israeli army. So one of the amazing things, and just to give some backstory, I guess, one of the amazing things about the past 10 years in Palestine and the internet in Palestine was really how, at the time of the Second Intifada, so much of the narrative about Palestine was really controlled by the mainstream media, and who had power when it came to mainstream media, which was mostly Israel. Palestinians at this time did not have good access to these kinds of Western media outlets, and also were not very liked by the racist populations in those countries. So when the internet came, and when people started having access to phones and mobile devices, they became very, very actively engaged with not only organizing, as you know of, in the Arab Spring, which happened in 2011, but also with capturing videos of violations happening on their farms, in their villages, at their schools, of Israeli soldiers, and posting these online. And the videos would gain thousands and thousands of views, hundreds of thousands of views many times. And so to try and protect its reputation, one of the things Israel is trying to do is prohibit people from photographing the army or videoing the army. And that would sentence people for 5 years for publishing any content that could hurt the soldiers' perception of the soldiers, their morale or reputation. And then we have other cases where they try to have bills to control the social media companies themselves, like the Facebook bill, which would require Facebook to remove any content that the government had deemed to be dangerous or inciting to violence, while on the national level and just in general globally, definitions of these things are very vague, which enables the government to cast wide nets about what type of censorship they would like to be doing, and in this case, try to get the social media companies to comply. There are also hundreds of arrests of Palestinians for incitement online. Every year we are still working on getting the accurate data and information about this. This slide's a little outdated, but we can say that every year there are several hundreds of arrests. This is a famous one, Doreen Tortur, a Palestinian poet, who was arrested during the last Gaza war for her poem about Gaza, and kept under house arrest for 2 years. So there's also the detention period and arbitrary detention, where you may just be held but never charged with anything. And in that way, we don't actually have much record of it. But in this case, she was under house arrest for 2 years, and it was quite an international case. Here are some other cases, 10 months in prison, 34 days of interrogation, more months in prison. A lot of people are targeted because of their political activism or political engagement online, and that's what's seen as incitement. But most of it is lawful engagement. So it's discriminatory, the way that the incitement is being applied. And then we also have the Israeli military online here. So you see some pages of, they are investigators that work for the government, and they're offering money to people to give them like information or secrets about certain people. So they recruit online. Here's another Israeli police account, but it's actually a fake profile of the Israeli police. And they try to become friends of people they're investigating or monitoring, collect private information about them, and then use this private information to pressure them into cooperating with them. And this is kind of also, you see here, also the government has a special cyber unit, which is in the Ministry of Justice, which recommends to Facebook which content should be taken down. So we know that Facebook relies on a lot of reporting from people, as well, of course, as artificial intelligence and machine learning, but they also rely on reports. And there is a lot of content that remains online that Israel considers is not acceptable, and they have tried to remove thousands. They have made thousands of requests within 1 year to remove content, and these numbers have been increasing over the years. And 85% of the requests of Israel were accepted by Facebook. So, for example, in this year, I guess there's like 14,000. In 2018, there were 14,000 requests, so 85% of those were respected by Facebook, and the content was taken down. So you can see how the government is supporting censorship and working to get the technology companies to supporting the technology companies in making targeted censorship that has political motivation. There's also many smear campaigns, fake news campaigns, and misinformation campaigns that the Israeli government and NGOs that support the Israeli government and that are founded to carry out different ministries' work on the civil society level. So that's an area that I could talk about more if people are interested. But one of my favorite talking points. And then we have, I won't play this video here, but it's on our website. We did a research that found every 66 seconds, a post is written against Palestinians in Hebrew online, and that this content just stays online. So there is a lot of hate speech that is remaining online. And I don't know why my screen, okay, great. Now we're gonna move on to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has a cybercrimes law. This law is used a lot of times to legitimize the arrest and interrogation of journalists and activists. It also does block websites of political adversaries to the Palestinian Authority. There are nearly 100 websites now blocked by the PA. This is just more about the cybercrimes law. The cybercrimes kind of laws are actually all over the world now. They were really pushed forth by Russia, but they spread all over the world. There's many in the MENA region, and mostly they seem to be addressing issues of digital rights and human rights, but they actually aren't. So it might seem good that there's a cybercrime law, but actually a lot of the laws are just giving more power to crack down on dissidents and more power for surveillance. Here are some arrests from under the cybercrimes law. And now Hamas authorities. So Hamas, they're using an old article of misuse of technology. It's a penal code from 1963, but they continue to arrest activists under this. They haven't updated to make it a digital law necessarily, but they continue to make their arrests. And many of the arrests are usually related to protesters who are protesting against Hamas and their service provisions or their politics, things like that. International tech companies. So companies are supposed to be abiding by the UN guiding principles of business and human rights. They should be conducting audits and looking to see the human rights impacts of their technologies on different populations. But we know that until this year, they hadn't done that, most of the tech companies, and definitely no tech company has published anything public about their human rights audits that they have conducted. including in high-profile cases like Myanmar, for example. Even though there is a response from the tech companies, they are not sharing the human rights audits at this point. And they weren't even doing them before, so it's good they're doing them now, at least as a start. I think also it's important in the context of Palestine to think about they have to have in the context of conflict zones, that there needs to be special policies and special attention to working in these spaces. But in the case of many companies, including also surveillance technology companies, it's really the opposite. Israel, even though Israel's Ministry of Defense is responsible for ensuring that companies like AnyVision here, which is a facial recognition company, comply, that their business, it's up to the standards of the UN guiding principles in human rights, that they do a human rights audit to look to see how their product is impacting Palestinians. They tend to turn a blind eye to this and to protect and always pretty much to protect the companies. So in the case of, in one specific case, and let's see how much slides I have on it, just this one, I'll just tell you the case of Microsoft and AnyVision. AnyVision is an Israeli company, like many surveillance companies, which is founded by people who were in the Israeli military's 8200 unit, which is their surveillance unit. And after they finished their military service, they started private companies that had contracts with the military where they developed surveillance technologies on Palestinian populations and on other populations, and then have gone to export these surveillance technologies to countries around the world and private companies, many of which are human rights violating. Famously, NSO Group, not AnyVision, different company, but famously NSO Group Technology, another Israeli company, was used in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was killed in Turkey, I think 2 years ago now, and has been used to target Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, human rights defenders, as well as many others, and is in the hands of several dangerous governments. Yeah, so next, Facebook and discrimination. So there's a lot of discrimination that happens to Palestinians online with Facebook, particularly because of their hate speech and their counterterrorism policies. But it's all kind of, the counterterrorism particularly is looked at as like anti-incitement, but it's very politically motivated. And we have several documented cases of Facebook working closely with the Israeli government working with the government, like to set up, here we have the incitement teams, but there are other, we cannot say they are working with the government. I think that's a bit too far to say, but that they do have cooperations at times. And we can also see the impacts of this, which we could go into more detail. But what we really find is that they're discriminatory in their treatment of Palestinians, in what content is left up versus what content is taken down. Something very interesting might be, that some of you might know about already actually, is anti-Semitism and the new definition of anti-Semitism and the efforts to redefine what is anti-Semitism by Israel supporting organizations and by Israel, to include criticism of Israel as being anti-Semitic. So that means that if you're a human rights defender and you said Israeli settlers are stealing land, that could be considered anti-Semitic, and that could be considered hate speech because you're criticizing these people and you're calling them settlers. And you're criticizing Israel, and it would be content that's taken down. So actually, this is a very hot policy topic right now, and it's been really a lot throughout North America and Europe, also on campuses, this discussion, but also at the tech company level, and also affecting the online. Google Maps. I think this video is actually kind of cute. Let's see. it will come through here, but Google Maps unfortunately does not have the names of Palestine. It's contributing to erasure. It doesn't have the, oh, the music is quite distracting. Hold on. Yes, it does not include it includes the names of illegal settlements. When you go to drive a direction, if you want to go from Tel Aviv to Ramallah, for example, it is not going to show you that there is a wall, that there's checkpoints, that there's things like that. Instead, it's going to just show you that it's easy to drive there. Of course, we know that these are actually high-risk areas, and even someone driving, for example, from Bethlehem to Ramallah, which is in the West Bank, on one side of the Israeli separation wall, that it would take you through settlements as a Palestinian, which is very, very dangerous. So actually, it doesn't reflect the reality of Palestine at all in the map, and it has Jerusalem recognized as Israel, which is also against international law. So the issue of Google Maps and the representation of space is one that Palestinians are really challenged with. And this has been ongoing for a long time. Oh, here we have some more images. Okay, these are just some recommendations. PayPal. All right. Palestinians are also discriminated when it comes to accessing financial platforms. Since 2016, after a first round of pressure from civil society, PayPal announced that it would not extend services to Palestinians. This is at the same time, they are providing services to Israelis who are in illegal settlements and contributing to the economic sustainability of those settlements in violation of international law. Unfortunately, PayPal and many financial providers continue to assess Palestinians as being high risk in a discriminatory manner without conducting the necessary audits and reviews that are non-discriminatory, and instead drawing on very politicized lists of individuals and organizations and countries that are considered high risk potentially. And so people who are in conflict zones, Palestinians amongst others, often are facing a lot of difficulty to get access to the global economy. Airbnb, welcome home to a Israeli settlement. So Airbnb has also provided settlers access to their platform. It has listings in many illegal settlements. There was a campaign by civil society to get Airbnb to take Israeli settlements off their platform and to open accessibility to Palestinians. And although they originally responded to the campaign positively, and they did remove the listings in the settlements, after an Israeli government supporting NGO in the United States filed lawsuits against Airbnb because of Jewish Americans in the settlements who they had discriminated against, Airbnb was pressured to put the settlements back up on their platform. And as a compensation to provide a bit of money, charity money, each time someone purchased a place to stay in a settlement to a charity that we don't know who they are sending to. Booking.com. Booking.com is a similar story. So also they have hotels and what do you call it? Like room and board, or not room and board, hotels and different places to stay, similar to Airbnb in the platform. So here I have some basic recommendations, which is incorporating Palestinian digital rights into with the international advocacy. So a lot of people are doing advocacy and activism, but there is ways to connect Palestinian digital rights to that. and also to look at freedom of expression, the right to privacy and assembly, and think about how this is impacted in the online. And like working to ensure that Palestinian civil society is protected, so that they can use digital tools in a safe way to advocate for themselves and to exert pressure on Israel, Hamas, and the PA for their state violations as well as company violations. So that completes this very brief introduction. I wanted to just share also a few links. Maybe I will stop sharing my screen. Okay, pause share. And I have my video back. Okay, I don't see it, but that's okay. All right, there we go. And then I will also share with you some links because we actually have the Palestine Digital Activism Forum coming up. It will be next week. And excuse me, the Digital Activism Forum is 5 days, and it's bringing together people from all across the world to look at digital rights issues impacting Palestinians. And we'll also have several technology companies there answering questions about the impact on Palestinians, workshops on different tools that digital activists can use, and different ways to support human rights and digital rights online. So I'm just writing in here the address for the website itself. Everything will be in Arabic and English. Sorry, there you go. And then also I will share Hamle, our main website, and my personal contacts. Let's open for questions, perhaps.
Thank you, Alison. That was deeply insightful. I learned a lot. I had no idea that companies, for example, like Airbnb and Google were in on the discriminatory policies and processes by the Israeli government. So I assume they're probably equally culpable in different parts of the world. It's hard to believe that a company like Airbnb that is just renting out spaces would collude with an oppressive government against minorities, and PayPal similarly. That's an extraordinary state of affairs. And by the way, do you know whether this is specific to Palestinians? Do you know if Airbnb or PayPal or Google are engaging in similar kinds of practices against minorities in other parts of the world?
I guess, unfortunately, so particularly with the context of occupation, you can see Google repeating what they do with Google Maps in the context of Ukraine and Russia, for example. If you're in Russia, you'll see the space as Russia. If you're in Ukraine, you'll see it still as Ukraine. There are also Kashmir and India. Many of the disputed, quote unquote, disputed territories, we see that Google takes the side of the oppressor consistently.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. And then also you have let's see, for content related issues like what happens with Facebook or actually let me stick on Google for a minute because I didn't mention also for example, YouTube, something very interesting there, that YouTube has a hyper surveillance on any content that comes from Palestine. So if you upload a video in Palestine and you upload the exact same video in France, the video in Palestine is way more likely to be taken down than the exact same video in France. And that's because it's an attempt to manage the scale of the content. But part of the problem here, kind of at the root source of the problem, is that the companies themselves shouldn't be the ones who are deciding. I mean, it's like the companies own the electricity, people talk about it, right? Social media social media interactions and the way that we interact and messaging and all of these things, we understand that these are private companies' policies, but also they should be under the, they have to be held accountable by by the governments, and to, you know, protect, for example, the First Amendment in the case of the United States, or in an international law framework, as I'm speaking about, you know, human rights law. But of course, there's such a space between what they should be doing, what they are doing, and what's the ramifications of them not doing that. What happens when you are violating rights? That's still so limited. So when it comes to the enforcement, also on the surveillance level, it's very difficult to address the rights violations that are happening with surveillance tech, which is like the new nuclear kind of, you know, weapon, you can say. So it spreads so rapidly now. It's so out of control with malware and spyware, and being used in really increasingly dangerous ways. And there's more and more efforts and money, of course, being put to build more infrastructure for this type of surveillance, and to have more cyber warfare. So we can see that our electricity systems, our water systems, our, you know, things that are basic for the health of populations can be also easily controlled and cut off, and, you know, those kinds of things. So.
Well, I think you're raising a very important issue, because all of us all over the world have been affected by the manipulation of social media. I mean, here in the United States, for example, in the 2016 election for President Trump against Hillary Clinton, you think of the vote in the United Kingdom around Brexit, with Cambridge Analytica manipulating both situations. And as I understand it from the documentaries that I've seen and research, the Israeli companies were in the background of Cambridge Analytica, providing the actual technical capacity to do what they did. You think of the Russians engaging in all kinds of social media nefariousness in the 2020 election, and various European countries reporting that there's been attempts to destabilize various social situations on social media. So what you're pointing to with this, in the specific case of the Palestinians, you're right, is a global phenomenon where the governments are not only engaging very actively in fake news and manipulated news, but so are the technology companies independent of the governments. And in this particular case, thinking of the United States with President Trump and his big lie about the US elections, it was Twitter that did the service, as it paradoxically turned out, on behalf of democracy by permanently banning Donald Trump from Twitter. But now, as you probably heard, the former president is creating his own social media conglomerate, so that he's coming into the social media domain in a few months' time with a huge capacity to foment fake news and violent rhetoric, racial rhetoric, sexually discriminatory rhetoric, as a private entity.
Exactly. And I mean, we already know that this is being done. I mean, a lot of the Islamophobia is really, I mean, unfortunately, and I will say that I think part of the challenge on the heart here also is like dealing with the history, right? Like you were saying, Jim, like how we have the Holocaust here in the background. So it makes it difficult to be critical of Israel and of what happened there. I think it makes people really uncomfortable. And for years, it has meant really close military relations also between the United States and Israel. and that our kind of horror of the Holocaust has made us turn a blind eye, as there have been a lot of, just so much development of global military capacity and surveillance through this pipeline through the US, through Israel, practiced in the occupation, practiced in the region, and then, sold beyond, far beyond. So unfortunately, Palestinians are like really so much at the Americans, Israel and Palestine is really the front part of a lot of what we're seeing now trickling down, I think, as someone said in the comments here. And it's been very difficult to get the US public and to get US lawmakers to make the military budgets of Israel less, to be more, give more oversight and more care about the human rights issue. And unfortunately, the amount of money to be made from it has been also so much. It's nearly $1 billion a year for Israel last year from surveillance technologies. It will continue, and it will be a problem of all of us. Now, there's many great activists and civil society organizations also like working on this. Hamlet is the first digital rights organization for Palestinians. And also, as I was mentioning before, that Palestinians have really not had their, I'm sorry, I'm having a very long day, but they have, their representation of them has not been as they would like to be portrayed. They've been really smeared as terrorists and as dangerous people in the world. And the smearing campaigns are very intentional by the Israeli government. We have, for example, Al-Haq organization, which is the oldest human rights organization in Palestine. It's with lawyers, and it's, has EU human rights awards, and you have the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs targeting them in a campaign online that calls them the terrorists, calls them terrorists in suits. That's what they said. So, that's a government campaign, and then all the support of the NGOs, and that then pushes it further into the policy level, targeting social media at college campuses, also with a lot of, positive content about Israel to try and minimize the human rights violations. Let's talk about how great Israel is for gays instead of talk about what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. Meanwhile, they're online targeting Palestinian gays and trying to get their private sexual content so that they can, share with their families that they're gay, and then target their family to work with them. So there's a lot of effort put into online reputations, and a lot of effort into getting information, whether public or private, as you said, to be able to control what people are thinking about them as a regime, and try to change international law also to weaken it so that it won't hold up and that they won't be held accountable for their war crimes.
Right. Well, I'd like to probe a little bit about the kind of current state of play in Israel. I've read a number of times that per capita, the largest peace movement in the world is Israeli. There are more Israelis engaged actively in the peace movement per capita than in any other country in the world. And so the support for what someone like you is doing is extraordinary there. And yet the oppressiveness of the government, particularly under Netanyahu, has been increasingly extreme in its rhetoric. How would you, Alison, describe, or how are you experiencing kind of the state of play in Israel between those that want sort of peace with the Palestinians and those that are continuing to oppress and engage in all manner of subterfuge against them?
So I'm not sure exactly what study you're referring to, because to be honest, everything that I know says that the left and the peace people who wanted peace in Israel is very, very small now. It's the smallest it's ever been in history of Israel.
Well, maybe it's gone down then. This was 2 or 3 years ago when they were having
yeah, it's definitely been going.
protests.
Yeah, and this election really shows that it's like the lowest ever.
Really?
And yeah, most people are what we would consider center, or like they are like extreme right wing, but they are more, but that's kind of become the center now in Israel. And you have a very extreme right. You have people who are like Jewish white supremacists, essentially. And you have the speech, including of politicians, that talks about eradicating Palestinians, and, you know, this classic, continue to have this very inflammatory hate speech also throughout the political campaign. I'm more focused on Palestinians than I am on the Israeli public. But I know that really there's not there's not a movement for peace. Actually, really, I think from the Palestinian civil society perspective, and also what's been really communicated clearly, are what Palestinians are asking for in regards to their rights, their right to return, a two-state solution, Jerusalem as a shared capital. And unfortunately, again and again, it's clear that Israel is not interested in this approach, that Israel is strategically, and we know we have many documentation of the strategy and the plans and things like this by now. And it's really to have a one state, to have an Israeli state, and unfortunately to have an apartheid state, because they're not planning to provide the Palestinians with the same rights as the Israelis. And you have now even Israeli human rights organizations, like a very famous one called B'Tselem, published this year their report about Israeli apartheid, and this is in Israel, in Gaza, in West Bank, looking at the whole situation as a congruous piece. But I think that it is important to keep the aspects of the two-state solution at mind, and to go back further than the two-state solution and look at the roots of the colonialism and what happened really since 1948. It still hasn't been dealt with. So having Israel established and Palestinians not getting what was promised to them in regards to, and having Israel established on their land from the beginning, as you were saying, they're an indigenous people. So also their rights from this approach needs to be dealt with, but still the majority of the West remains wanting a two-state solution with peace between the both sides. And this does not address the issues of colonialism. So if we're in a decolonial process now and we need to heal these wounds of colonialism, we have to go back to that. We cannot get sidetracked in a two-state solution that no one wants, actually, really, very few people really want a two-state solution. Yeah.
And what would you say, Alison, is the current state among the Palestinian people? I mean, if you look back over the last, 3-4 decades, there's been a series of intifadas, and then it ebbs into sort of a quiescence, and then something ignites, another revolt, and there's agitation. It seems that we've moved beyond the time of actual wars between Syria and Egypt and Israel, etc. But the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank, still smolder. What's your sense of what the current state of say morale or the situation is among the Palestinians?
It's considered a historic low, especially after President Trump's recent, declaration of Jerusalem being capital of Israel and moving the embassy of the U.S. there. That was seen as particularly harsh, and then also the Abraham Accords, also, and the relationships that Israel now have built with the UAE and with other, and it will follow more and more with different Arab and Gulf countries who are looking to access surveillance technologies and are willing to make agreements with Israel and to normalize their relationships with Israel. Anyways, they don't want, the Palestine problem has been, it's a part of the old nationalist, Arab pan-nationalist movement of the 70s, which was an amazing movement, like many of the movements for liberation throughout history, where people were coming together more broadly than just their states, but which now has really dissipated. And now you can see that the whole region is very fractured, and that there's a series of proxy wars happening there between Turkey, Iran, the US, Russia, and that this is really what's happening in the region now. Vaccines, someone asked about vaccines for Palestine. So I think that's also just a good, question I just see here I wanted to answer. So Israel is like one of the first countries in the world, is really like pushing to have everyone vaccinated, and they are getting closer and closer with loads of efforts. At the same time, they have 500,000 settlers in the Palestinian territories in the West Bank who are being vaccinated, and all the Palestinians, they did not give the Palestinian Authority, nor in Gaza, nor in West Bank, access to vaccines. And it is the responsibility, actually, of Israel as the occupying power under international law to ensure that people can access basic health services, these kinds of basic health services. So even if the PA is an intermediary, they are still obligated to provide this, and they have not done this. So, a lot of people have been talking about medical apartheid more and more, and this is one example, one way it shows up.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Now, as we bring this to a close, Alison, I'd like to ask you, I guess, a final area of exploration around, given where you are, given what you know about the situation, what would you say is a practical yet idealistically fathomable way out? You're dealing in one of the most complex, compacted areas in the world. There's probably no area more convoluted than the Middle East, and the center of that locus of contradictions is the Israeli-Palestinian fulcrum. How would you work your if you were a king or queen for a day, how would you work our way out of this?
Well,
That makes
I think
practical sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very practical sense. Yeah, I mean, the two-state solution in some senses could have been a middle ground and a compromise that would have got us part of the way to where we really need to go, which is back deeper, and to deal, like you were saying at the beginning of the call, to have reparations for Palestinians as well. And that's something that, Palestinians are asking for the right to return. There are millions of refugees, also just in neighboring countries, Jordan, Syria, but also all over the world now. And having the right to return being one thing, but also I think, a question of reparations, a question of what's the, we are still too far for that to be practical conversation. Really, unfortunately. But some of the basis of the two-state solution, I think, is met some of the most basic needs for both people to be in some sense of security. But unfortunately, this is not serving the political agendas of the powerful. And so we will not have this two-state solution, it seems. So instead, I mean, really practical things, I would say. And also Israel is a very hard actor to move because of the relationship with the United States and because of the United States and Israel's relationship with international bodies. It's very difficult. But we do know that things like boycotts do work, divestments do work. Looking at Israeli surveillance technology companies, and if, who's investing them, like we did with Microsoft last year, and bringing to Microsoft's attention that their technology was developed on Palestinians in an illegal way, led to getting that in the media, put pressure on Microsoft to conduct a human rights audit of the company, and decided to divest from it, a $70 million divestment. So it can be the divestment you do at the grocery store, or it can be bigger divestments that we're talking about here. But those kind of things do make the government and do make companies think about more lawful ways of carrying out their work. That if you're going to pick surveillance technologies, at least pick one that wasn't developed on, somebody who's occupied. Pick one that is developed in a lawful manner, and which is designed to, have accountability as a part of it and human rights as a part of its design. So I think that's important for us to be making choices and to be holding decision makers and duty bearers accountable for that, as they will make more and more choices in coming years about how these technologies will impact all of our lives.
So if you had to recommend an action for our Humanity Rising community and the audience today, what would it be? To work on divestment? Maybe you could say something about your organization and how people could specifically support you. Oh, looks like Alison went dark. Did we lose Alison?
No, she's still there. She's frozen, Jim.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe this is a signal to bring this session to a close, everyone. Thank you, Alison, if you can still hear me. You've done a splendid job bringing to our attention.
We lost Alison completely, Jim.
Yeah. Alison did a splendid job bringing to our attention one of the sorest, rawest pain points in the world today. And again, as I said at the beginning, it's less useful to project all of our prejudices and feelings onto the Israeli-Palestinian issue. There are strong feelings everywhere around this issue. We understand that. But to use that as a mirror, how is that situation over there a mirror to what we're experiencing in our own countries, in our own communities, with the manipulation of social media? I think it's a fair statement that every government in the world is doing in one way or another what the Israeli government is doing, circumscribing human rights, making it harder for journalists to investigate the truth, making it more difficult for the public to scrutinize the services. Just imagine George Floyd, if it had been illegal to take that video. It was the video that ignited the conscience of the world. Governments all over the planet are making it more and more difficult for the public and for journalists to get to the truth. So Alison Ramer, everyone, is one of a heroine of our time. She's on the front line of one of the most cutting edge areas in which human rights, democracy, coercion, control are commingling and coming together, the outcome of which will determine to a large degree the fate of freedom everywhere. So I really want to thank Alison for everything that she brought to us today. I want to encourage as many of you who can to join our after session chat group. The link is in the chat box. And then tomorrow, we're going to go cosmic. We're going to look at macro cosmic cosmology and look at the way scientists are describing the world. We've been digging in, like we did today, to the very nitty-gritty issues of human agony. And tomorrow we want to go to the other end of the cosmos, breathe a little bit more deeply, realize that we're in a vast, interwoven Indra's net of life and learning and goodness. That whatever we felt today, whatever agony you've empathetically felt for the Palestinians and oppressed people everywhere, hold it within the larger frame of a living universe. That, as Plotinus said several thousand years ago, breathes together. The whole universe breathes together. Thank you, everyone. See you again here on Humanity Rising tomorrow. Same time, same station, 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, since we're still in daylight savings. So be sure to look at your clocks. Bye, everyone. See you again tomorrow.